Claude responded, "At my daughter's wedding, my new son-in-law's mother stood up during the toasts and told everyone in that ballroom that I didn't belong at the head table anymore." At my daughter's wedding, my new son-in-law's mother stood up during the toasts and told everyone in that ballroom that I didn't belong at the head table anymore. I just set down my glass, smiled at my daughter, and walked out into the parking lot without another word. 3 weeks later, a sheriff's deputy was knocking on that woman's front door. "My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 64 years old, and before I tell you what happened outside that banquet hall, you need to understand everything that led up to it, because none of it was an accident, and none of it was sudden. If you believe in family, in loyalty, and in people eventually getting exactly what they've earned, stay with me until the end. Now let me start from the beginning. I built my hardware store on Route 9 outside of Asheville, North Carolina, back in 1985. I was 26 years old then, married 2 years to my wife Louise, and we were expecting our first and only child, a daughter we'd name Emily. We didn't have much starting out. I remember sleeping on a cot in the back room some nights just to save on gas money for the drive home. But that store became our whole life. Louise did the books by hand at our kitchen table every night for the first 10 years. I built the shelving myself, plank by plank, and I still remember the smell of fresh cut pine in that place every morning before we opened. We raised Emily practically inside that store. She did her homework behind the register as a little girl, and by the time she was 16, she was running the paint counter better than most of my employees. Louise passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer. It moved fast, faster than any of the doctors expected. And within 8 months of her diagnosis, I was a widower running a hardware store alone in a town where every corner reminded me of her. Emily worried about me something fierce in those years. She'd call every single night just to make sure I'd eaten dinner, just to hear my voice and know I was still standing. So when she met a man named Cole Ashby at a friend's barbecue 2 years ago, and things moved quickly toward marriage, I told myself I was happy for her. I told myself that watching my only daughter build a life with someone was exactly what Louise would have wanted for me to witness. I didn't know then that Cole's mother, a woman named Deborah Ashby, had very specific ideas about what our family was supposed to look like, and that my daughter's wedding day would only be the beginning of something far bigger than any of us understood at the time. Looking back now, I can see the signs were there from the very first dinner I had with the Ashby family. But a lonely widower doesn't always want to see clearly, and I wanted so badly to believe my daughter had found real happiness. I welcomed Cole into our family without a single reservation. I helped him get a job managing inventory at my store when his last employer downsized. I never once thought that kindness would come back to bite me. Deborah Ashby was 58 years old, a retired real estate broker who still acted like she had a listing to close in every conversation she had. She was warm in front of people at church, always complimenting Emily's hair or her cooking in front of a crowd, but I noticed things the rest of the family seemed to miss. Within the first year after the engagement, she had already started referring to my hardware store as the family business, in a way that made my skin crawl, like she was already doing the math on what it might be worth someday. She asked Emily, more than once, whether I had a will drawn up, whether the store was in a trust, whether I'd ever considered protecting the asset now that I was getting older and living alone. Cole worked long hours for me at the store, and every evening he came home a little more distant, caught between his mother's opinions and his new wife's patience. I watched my future son-in-law shrink some month over month. He used to crack jokes with the customers, easy and relaxed. By the time the wedding rolled around, he mostly just nodded along whenever his mother spoke at family gatherings. I never said a bad word about Deborah to Emily, not once, because I could see my daughter was already trying to keep the peace between two families that didn't quite fit together. But I noticed how Deborah talked about my store like it was already half decided who'd inherit it. I noticed how she asked Cole, in front of me, why I hadn't put his name on the deed to the building yet. I told myself I was being an overly suspicious old man. I told myself Emily was happy, and that was enough for me to keep my mouth shut. About 5 months before the wedding, Emily came to see me alone on a Sunday afternoon, while Cole was at his mother's house helping her with something in the yard. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table Louise used to balance our books on late at night, and she had a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 17, and scared to tell me she'd wrecked the car. She slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me and told me to put it somewhere safe, somewhere Deborah would never think to look. I asked her what it was. She said, "Dad, just trust me on this. If anything ever feels wrong after the wedding, open this before you do anything else." I laughed a little. told her she was being dramatic, that nothing bad was going to happen at her own wedding. She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before, somewhere between worry and resolve. I took the envelope without opening it and locked it in the small fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, the same safe where Louise used to keep our marriage license and Emily's birth certificate. I trusted my daughter completely and didn't ask another question that day. Looking back now, I wonder how long she'd already suspected something and how long she'd been quietly working to protect me without ever saying the words out loud. That envelope sat untouched in my closet for 5 months, and I had no idea it would end up saving nearly everything I had left. The wedding was held on a warm Saturday evening in early June at a banquet hall just outside of town, the same hall where Emily had gone to her senior prom 9 years earlier. More than 150 guests came. Old customers from the store, high school friends of Emily's, cousins from 3 different states, and half the congregation from our church. I walked my daughter down the aisle myself, and I will tell you, my hands were shaking the whole way, not from nerves, but from a kind of pride so big it nearly knocked the wind out of me. Louise should have been there. I felt her absence in every second of that ceremony, but I also felt something like peace, knowing Emily had found someone who, on paper at least, seemed to love her. The reception moved into the toasts around 8 o'clock. I gave mine first, a short one about watching my daughter grow from a little girl behind a paint counter into the woman standing in front of me. People laughed, people cried a little, and I sat back down at the head table feeling like maybe everything really was going to be all right. Then Deborah stood up with a champagne glass in her hand, and the room quieted down, expecting a sweet mother of the groom toast. Instead, she looked directly at me, still smiling that church smile of hers, and she said, loud enough for every table near the front to hear clearly, I just think it's time we're honest with each other. Harold, sweetheart, you've had your moment giving this girl away. Maybe it's time you understand this new family comes first now, and that includes decisions about the business you've been sitting on for 40 years. This isn't your seat to hold on to forever. The room went dead silent. I saw Emily's face go white as her wedding dress. I saw my cousin Ray freeze with a fork halfway to his mouth. I saw the pastor who'd married them not 20 minutes earlier stare down at the tablecloth, unsure where to look. Every single person at that reception heard a woman I barely knew announce, on my daughter's wedding day, that I no longer belonged at the head table of my own family. I did not raise my voice. I did not say a single word back to her. I looked at Deborah for a long moment, and something inside me went completely calm, the way a lake goes still right before the first frost sets in. I thought about Emily's envelope sitting in my closet at home. I thought about 40 years of building that hardware store from nothing. Then I stood up slowly, buttoned my jacket, walked over to my daughter, kissed her on the forehead, and told her I loved her more than anything on this earth. I didn't say another word to Deborah. I walked straight out of that banquet hall and into the parking lot, and I did not look back once. My oldest friend, a man named Gerald Ochoa, had been sitting 2 tables back with his wife Marilyn. Gerald and I had known each other since we were both 19 years old, working construction crews together the summer before I opened the store. He'd been at every important moment of my life for 45 years, and he'd heard exactly what Deborah said in that ballroom. When he saw me heading for the exit, he got up without a word and followed me out into the parking lot. He found me leaning against my truck, staring up at the sky, and he didn't ask a single question. He just put a hand on my shoulder and said, Come on, Harold. Let's get you home. You can talk when you're ready. Gerald drove me back to my house himself that night while Marilyn stayed behind to help Emily manage the rest of the reception. I sat in Gerald's kitchen a couple hours later, and he poured us both a cup of coffee we didn't really want, just something to hold on to. You want to talk about it? He asked. I told him everything. The comment about the business, the way Deborah smiled the whole time she said it, the way half the room had looked at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Gerald shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. That store is yours, Harold, he said. Been yours since before Emily was even born. That woman's got no say in a single brick of that building. I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on that envelope, still locked in my safe at home, the one Emily had told me to open if anything ever felt wrong. That night, after Gerald had gone to bed, I sat alone at my own kitchen table under the small lamp Louise used to read by, and I finally opened it. Inside were 3 things that changed everything I thought I understood about my daughter's marriage. The first was a printed copy of an email exchange between Cole and Deborah from 4 months earlier, one Emily had apparently found on a shared family email account Cole had forgotten to log out of on the home computer. In it, Deborah had written to her son, explaining, in plain language, that once the wedding was finalized, they needed to start having conversations with me about transferring partial ownership of the hardware store into a trust that named Cole as a co-trustee for tax purposes, she'd written, though anyone reading it could see exactly what she meant. The second item was a printed statement from a small business consultant, one Deborah had apparently hired without my knowledge, outlining an appraisal estimate of my store's property and inventory, valued at just over $1 million given the land alone, which sat on a stretch of Route 9 that had exploded in commercial value over the last decade. The third item was a handwritten letter from Emily herself. In it, she explained that she'd found the email by accident 3 months before the wedding, and that she'd spent weeks quietly gathering everything she could because she didn't want to believe her future mother in law was capable of something so calculated. But she needed me to have proof, just in case things ever escalated the way she feared they might. She wrote that she loved Cole, and she believed he wasn't part of his mother's scheming, but she wasn't certain. And she needed me to protect myself no matter what happened, no matter how things looked on the outside. She asked me to forgive her for not telling me sooner, and to trust that she'd only stayed quiet because she was still hoping she was wrong about all of it. I sat at that kitchen table and read her letter 3 times, tears running down my face, not just from the sting of the wedding, but from something else too. A kind of clarity settling into my chest like a weight lifting. My daughter had seen this coming. My daughter had spent months quietly protecting her father from a woman who saw our family's most important day as nothing more than a business opportunity. I folded everything carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and for the first time since Deborah stood up with that champagne glass, I did not feel like a fool anymore. The following Monday morning, while I was still staying at Gerald's guest room to clear my head, I got a call from my daughter. Her voice was shaking. She told me that over the weekend, while she and Cole were still supposedly on their honeymoon in the mountains, Deborah had visited my store during business hours and told my longtime store manager, a woman named Patsy Coyne who'd worked the front counter for 22 years, that there would be some ownership changes coming soon, and that Patsy should start preparing paperwork for a transition. Patsy, confused and rattled, had called Emily directly instead of me, since Emily's name was still listed as an emergency contact on file. Deborah was already moving, less than 72 hours after standing up in that ballroom and announcing my time at the head of my own family had ended. What Deborah didn't know was that Emily's letter had already told me exactly where to look and exactly who to call. That same Monday afternoon, I contacted an old family friend, a man named Nathaniel Pruitt, who'd been a business attorney in Asheville for nearly 30 years. He'd handled the incorporation paperwork for my store back in 1991, and he'd known Emily since she was in diapers. I told Nathaniel everything: the toast at the wedding, the envelope, the email, the appraisal, Patsy's phone call about ownership changes already being discussed. Nathaniel told me to sit tight, and within a few hours, he called back with news that turned my stomach cold. He'd pulled the county business filings that morning and discovered that 3 weeks before the wedding, someone had filed an amendment with the North Carolina Secretary of State's office adding a new registered agent to my store's business license. A name I didn't recognize at first, Deborah R. Ashby, listed as co-agent alongside my own name, which had been on that filing alone for over 30 years. The signature on the amendment was supposedly mine. The problem was, according to the notary stamp attached to that filing, it had been signed and notarized on a Tuesday afternoon when I could prove, down to the minute, that I'd been 40 miles away at a supplier's warehouse in Hickory, picking up a shipment of lumber with 2 employees standing right beside me the entire time. Nathaniel did not waste a single hour once he found that filing. He'd been practicing law long enough to recognize exactly what he was looking at: a forged business filing, backdated and notarized under false pretenses to make it look legitimate. He pulled the notary's license number listed on the amendment and discovered the notary herself, a woman named Rhonda Pilkins, had no record whatsoever of ever notarizing anything for me on that date or any other date in her career. Nathaniel suspected, and later confirmed, that Deborah had paid Rhonda, a former colleague of hers from her real estate days, to forge the notary stamp using an old seal Rhonda still kept from a previous job. Nathaniel explained to me that this wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This was business fraud and forgery, both serious felonies under North Carolina law, both crimes that carried real prison time. He asked me one simple question before doing anything further. Harold, do you want to handle this quietly within the family, or do you want to report it? I thought about Emily, about the letter in her own handwriting, about how hard my daughter had worked in the months before her own wedding to protect a father she loved. I thought about Deborah standing up at that head table, smiling while she told a room full of 150 people that I no longer belonged in my own family. I looked at Nathaniel and said, "Report every bit of it." Nathaniel filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina Secretary of State's Fraud Division that same afternoon, along with copies of the forged filing, the notary's false records, and Emily's letter as supporting documentation. By the end of the week, the case had been forwarded to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office Financial Crimes Unit. The detective assigned to the case was a man named Detective Wayne Marsh, a 19-year veteran who specialized in business and property fraud. Nathaniel met with him personally and walked him through the entire timeline. The wedding toast in front of 150 witnesses, the visit to my store demanding paperwork changes within days of the ceremony, and the forged filing submitted 3 weeks before the wedding even happened. Detective Marsh pulled additional records that same week, including my supplier's delivery logs from Hickory, confirming I had genuinely been out of town, with witnesses on the exact date the filing claimed I'd signed it in Asheville. He also reached out to the business consultant Deborah had hired to appraise my store, a man who had no idea the ownership transfer he'd been asked to estimate for was connected to a fraudulent filing. That consultant, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a criminal investigation, immediately turned over every email Deborah had sent him, including one from months earlier where she referred to the whole plan as getting ahead of things before the old man gets any more stubborn about his will. Detective Marsh told Nathaniel that between the forged notary stamp, my ironclad alibi, and Emily's original letter laying out the timeline months in advance, he had more than enough for a warrant. Everything Deborah had rushed to set in motion in the weeks surrounding her son's wedding was now working directly against her, one document at a time, exactly the way Emily had quietly prepared for it to happen if things ever went as far as they did. 3 weeks after the wedding, on a Thursday morning, a Buncombe County Sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway of Deborah's home in a quiet subdivision on the east side of town. My cousin Ray, who happened to live 2 streets over and had heard the whole story by then through Gerald, told me later that Deborah answered the door in her bathrobe, confused and clearly still half asleep. Detective Marsh identified himself and informed her that he was investigating a filed complaint of business fraud and forgery connected to a registered agent amendment filed with the state, and that he had several questions regarding a notarized document under scrutiny. According to Ray, Deborah's face went pale standing right there in her own doorway. She tried explaining that I had verbally agreed to the changes before the wedding, but Detective Marsh calmly informed her that delivery records placed me 40 miles away with 2 witnesses on the exact date the filing claimed I'd signed it in person. Deborah was brought in for formal questioning that same day, along with Rhonda Pilkins, the notary who'd forged the stamp. Within 2 weeks, both women were formally charged. Deborah with forgery and attempted business fraud, and Rhonda with forgery and notary misconduct. The fraudulent amendment was voided immediately by the Secretary of State's office once the forgery was confirmed, restoring the business license to my name alone, exactly where it had legally always belonged and had never actually left. Cole came to see me himself about a week after his mother was charged. He looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in a month. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Emily had once slid that envelope across to me, and he told me he'd had no idea what his mother had been planning behind the scenes, that he'd found out everything at the same time the rest of us had. I believed him, mostly because Emily believed him, and because my daughter has always had better instincts about people than she gives herself credit for. Cole told me he and Deborah weren't speaking anymore, that he'd told her flatly he wanted nothing to do with what she'd tried to. I appreciated him saying it, though I understood some trust takes a long time to rebuild, if it ever fully does. Deborah eventually took a plea deal on the fraud charges, avoiding the maximum sentence but still receiving probation, a permanent criminal record, and a court order to repay the legal fees connected to the false filing, along with a fine that ate through most of her retirement savings from her real estate years. She reached out to me exactly once after the plea deal, a short letter I never answered. Some things don't need a response. Emily and Cole still come by the store most Sundays, and some evenings I catch myself standing behind that same paint counter Emily used to run as a teenager. And I think about Louise, about how proud she would have been of the woman our daughter turned into. I think about how, even in the weeks leading up to the happiest day of her life, Emily found a way to protect her father, quietly, without ever making a scene, because that's simply who she is. That envelope in my closet wasn't just paperwork. It was my daughter's love for me. delivered months before either of us knew it would be needed. I didn't lose a child the way some fathers do, and I know how fortunate that makes me. But I came closer than I ever want to admit to losing the one thing I built with my own two hands. And more than that, I came closer to losing my faith in the family I still had left. I got to keep the store Louise and I built from nothing. And more importantly, I got to keep the truth of who my daughter really is, proven in the one moment it mattered most. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video. Claude responded, "The truth is, love doesn't always announce itself loudly. The truth is, love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it looks like a sealed envelope tucked away months in advance, a quiet phone call, a daughter watching out for her father without ever making a scene. Family isn't tested on the easy days, but on the ones where staying calm and staying kind feels hardest. Hold on to the people who protect you quietly. That's the love worth keeping." A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a genuine and positive life lesson with you.